Great, thank you very much.
No problem. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Awesome. So we're a little bit short on time since we only have 1 hour. So I think we'll continue to let people in, but we can, I'm gonna go ahead and get started and just welcome our presenters and you all to the panel. So this is systemic violence and resistance, and we have 3 to 4 papers, depending on presenters. So we have Felicity Stone Richards, who will be presenting Black Lives Matter in Japan too, analyzing Japanese grassroots activism against anti-Black discrimination and police harassment. Then we will have Claire Crawford and Ayana Best, who will be presenting Can We Say Their Names Too? The silencing of Black, trans, and masculine presenting women around police violence in the media. And then we will have Carolyn Coles, Masked Emotion, Police Officer Perception of Threat in the Era of COVID-19. And hopefully, we're supposed to have a 4th paper by Monique Newton. So hopefully maybe she's just having some technical difficulties. But her paper is Race My Mind, Trauma Discourse among Defund the Police Organizations in Chicago. So I'm your discussant, Jalili Matos. I'm your chair, Jalili Matos, sorry. And our discussant today is Onyekachi Ikiogu. And she is at Arizona State University. Okay, so we'll get started. Without further ado, Felicity.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending our panel. So yes, as has been mentioned, I will be discussing the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan. So as we all know, the summer of 2020 witnessed an extraordinary upheaval of resistance against police brutality in the United States. And this triggered not only a number of solidarity movements in other countries, but movements in other countries that were themselves also tackling the anti-Blackness in their societies. And we saw this across Europe, across Latin America, in places with large African diasporas. We saw this on the African continent with people protesting the corrupt police, in Nigeria and Kenya. But despite all of this coverage, there has been less attention spent on the solidarity movement in Asian countries due to the far lower numbers of Black people that live in Asia. But despite the fact that these numbers are low, there was a significant Black Lives Matter movement across East Asian countries, and particularly in Japan. Japan witnessed a significant surge in protest, in media coverage, specifically targeting the anti-Blackness in Japanese society. And Japanese activists have now been consistently pushing against the mistreatment of Black Japanese citizens and Black immigrants in Japan. And for the first time, anti-Blackness as a Japanese problem has been discussed in mainstream media and elsewhere. So what I'm going to discuss in this conference paper is specifically the attempts at political education. So the different social media organizations and the different BLM chapters that have been aiming to educate Japanese people on, how their anti-Blackness is surfacing, and to also zone in on one particular issue, which is the issue of police harassment of Black people and other people of color. So to start with, when the protests were organized, these were organized by BLM affiliated chapters in Tokyo, in Kansai, and in Fukuoka. And the people organizing these protests were a mix of Black Japanese citizens and Black immigrant students. So, and what's very important to recognize is not only was the group international, both international and domestic, but also just as the people who were at the forefront of pushing Black Lives Matter in the United States, the people pushing for this discussion in Japan are overwhelmingly women and queer femmes. So these are Black Japanese and Black American women and queer femmes who are, at the forefront of this movement. And what we also have are Japanese, again, ethnic Japanese women who are the most consistent allies in terms of building up the awareness of Japanese racism. One of these being Naomi Kawahara, who is founder of Japan for Black Lives, which is a social media organization that has been, writing a number of blogs and breakdowns of, microaggression, the problem of blackface in Japanese media and Japanese society, how it's dismissed, cultural appropriation, and a number of other issues. And two of the lead organizers, BLM Tokyo, Sierra Todd and Jamie Smith. Sierra Todd is mixed Black Japanese and Jamie Smith is Black American. In BLM Fukuoka, you have Athena Lisa, who's Black American, Bako Nguasong, who's from Cameroon, and Rianne Victoria, who's also American. So this is really, a whole spread of different kinds of people that are advocating for a better understanding of Japanese anti-Black discrimination. But what we also have is a number of Instagram and social media groups from people who are not necessarily based in Japan, but who have a strong cultural connection to Japan that are also trying to educate the Black Japanese people on how anti-Blackness functions in Japan. And one of these has been the social media company Blossom Media, which started out as just an Instagram chat that was started by a Japanese American student, and that now their employment encompasses, a number of Asian and Asian American people who either were raised in Japan or have some strong connection to Japan, but also have some strong connection to America. They went to school in America. And so they are speaking to both the Japanese and American audience. They write posts on, the problems of police brutality, on systemic racism, on, the mental health problems that occur as a result of racism. And they write these posts in both Japanese and English. So they are, they have not, even though many of them are now based in the United States, they are very much speaking to a Japanese audience as well as an American audience. And again, these people come from, all countries. There's Ariel Chu, who's an Australian-born Chinese person, Emira Okada, who was born and raised in Japan, but currently at college in California, Mia Glass, who's American-born, but she has mixed white and Japanese ancestry. And again, this is a transnational movement, it's an international movement, and there are multiple parties involved in the political education of the Japanese audience. And one of the things that has also come up is the diversity of media tactics that are developing in trying to get the word out. BLM Tokyo has created a zine called Kokuzine, because zine is how you pronounce zine in Japanese, but it's also a play on words because Kokujin is the word for Black people. And so this zine is also bringing together poetry, essays, fashion, photography from Black people based in Japan, so Black creators based in Japan. So what is happening here is not simply a magazine that's, critiquing Japan, even though it is critiquing Japan, but it's also trying to give creative and professional opportunities to Black creatives in Japan. And importantly, this zine was one of the only essays that drew attention to poor Black African laborers, because up until now, the conversation had been dominated by middle-class Black, mixed-race Black Japanese people, and Black immigrant students who themselves are generally, if not from a more privileged socioeconomic background, they are privileged in the space that they occupy in Japan as international students. And so, the experience of poor Black African laborers who are now, working the, relatively poorly paid, dirty jobs in Japan, their voices had not been heard as much. And so one of the essays in BLM Tokyo was from a Black Ugandan worker who was bringing attention to the issues around their visa insecurity, their mistreatment, and their mistreatment even from their other peers, from other workers, and the language difficulties to such an extent that he didn't even realize he was being insulted for a long time. That the nickname that people had for him, he thought that this was a good thing, and in fact, they were just it was a nickname based on insulting his skin color. So all of these things are coming to the fore in a lot of different media, both in mainstream media, on social media, in magazines. There's a graphic magazine called Cypher, which deals with social justice issues, through comics, through everybody writing a comic to explain a certain social justice issue. And the artist Moi, who's an Afro-Brazilian living in Japan, drew a comic on the arrest and harassment of Jamie Smith, who was one of the BLM Tokyo activists, stopped and questioned by the cops because they thought that she stole her bike. And, for no other reason except that, you're a Black person with a bike, where's that bike registered? Where'd you get that bike from? And so this was a comic strip outlining that interaction. And so again, what we see happening here is that there is no single form of expression for everybody who's trying to tackle, raise awareness of the kind of forms that anti-Blackness takes in Japan. But to turn now to, how and why the question of police harassment came up is that right around the time that, the George Floyd had been murdered, there had already been a case in Japan of a Kurdish man being thrown to the ground and aggressed by Japanese police. And, this in a country where most of the time the country believes that, it's a very non-violent country, that the police most of the time don't do anything because there's not really that much crime for them to get involved with. This for a lot of people was a shock for the Japanese audience, but was not a shock for people of color who are well used to being harassed by the police. And so this video, as it was making the rounds, was used to then draw attention to other instances of police harassment. And again, Japan for Black Lives has been essential in, really talking about and amplifying the stories that they came across, the people that they interviewed. There was another Black Japanese person who in January 2021 was stopped because he had dreadlocks. And, the police, as they're stopping him, are saying, oh, we need to search you for drugs because, people with your hairstyle, they often have drugs. And just, saying that plainly to his face, knowing he's being recorded. And, the degree to which Black hairstyles of a certain form of Blackness was associated with criminality was made the topic of discussion, in articles in the Abima Times, in articles in the Huffington Post. And again, Japan for Black Lives has really made this their issue to really focus on. And they are now beginning the job of, collecting survey data to now, put a number to what up until now have been a lot of anecdotal stories. And so now we want to find out, okay, for now, Black people living in Tokyo, so for now, Black people living in Tokyo, they're trying to find the numbers. How many of you have been harassed? How many times a year? What happened? And to actually start pressuring the Japanese government to address this behavior. And that is it for me.
Great. Thank you so much, Felicity. And just to let you all know, I am going to use this one when you have like 5 minutes left. And then this one when your time is up. Because sometimes I know the chat is a little hard to see when you're focused. Okay, so we have our next presenters, which are Claire Crawford and Ayana Best.
Great, thank you. So I'll share my screen. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Crawford. I'm a PhD student at USC in LA. I'm gonna go ahead and say Dr. Bess because you already turned in that dissertation, and so I'm here presenting with Ayana. And we're working on this paper called "Can We Say Their Names Too? The Silencing of Black Queer Women Around Police Violence in the Media." The main kind of focus and background to how this came to be for us is one, I'm identify as a masculine presenting Black lesbian. And so, you know, as we saw the rise of George Floyd, I also know there's a ton of names that we'll never call, those being both trans and mask, right? Like, so even when we're considering like, how would you even identify Black masked women in the media, that was even more absent. And at least we could find some traces of Black trans lives matter. And of course, some of this conversation came up in 2020 around the death of a Black trans brother, Tony McDade. And again, also then being misgendered and wondering if it was actually a allowable encounter, I know also happened within the Black community. So what is happening not only just in the media, but also with our own community and how we're naming what is going on with Black queer folks. And so we particularly focus on why are Black trans and masculine presenting women left out of conversations of police brutality? What do movements like BLM and Say Her Name lose when silencing Black queer women? And how does mainstream media exacerbate the marginalization of these women? And so thinking one, how these folks are collectively outside. When we talk about bounding, if we think about Kathy Cohen's work of Boundaries of Blackness, bounding the Black queer community, but what members of the community do we see publicly? And what is our like the ever-changing boundaries of Black queerness and what is acceptable and what is not, right? And so we know oftentimes when we think about Black queer men, we see that in relation to, unfortunately, HIV and AIDS. Maybe now, you know, we talked a little bit about, is it acceptable and to some extent for Black queer folks to perform in drag as a public kind of entertainment, like what spaces are we accepting Black queerness into, but particularly what is the experience of Black queer masked women and trans women? And so they defy both the understanding of Black womanhood and Blackness. So one, we also know, and the idea of Say Her Name Too is pushing for the fact that Black women are not being said, their names are not being said, and they're not being put at the forefront. So how is media even bounding a movement started by Black queer folks, be making them absent in that representation, and that silence existing across their existences all together, right? So not only just in the media, but also within the Black community, within some of these movement spaces, even though they're very much grounded and run by and supported by Black queerness, why is it not making it out of that space is kind of like the questions that we're asking and thinking about being collectively outside. And when we talk about confronting violence, we're really thinking about the intersectional dynamics of violence experience. So not only thinking about state violence coming in racially, but also the gendered class experience that's coming in, and also moving beyond masculine militarized responses to the state violence. So a lot of times the kind of responses we get is also helps to elevate whose names are being said. And so how are we choosing which names get to be pushed forward, who's doing it? And so how do we not minimize and marginalize the harm done in these communities, even though we often know that they're present and doing a lot of the work in the spaces, particularly movement spaces? Ayana.
Yes, so for the methods for this project, we decided to complete a content analysis, a qualitative content analysis. And unfortunately, looking at mainstream media news outlets, we were only able to find 58 newspaper articles that mention any of the terminology that you see listed below. Can you go to the next slide? Oh my gosh. Overall, we find that Black queer women are invisible in mainstream media, and by leaders of mainstream Black movements, including Black Lives Matter, since a lot of the primary leaders the primary founders may have been women, but currently the leaders and folks who are in positions of power for organizations or movements like BLM are not women. And they do not, they leave out trans and Black queer women in general in speeches and press releases, et cetera. And two, when they mention, when they are mentioned, when Black queer women are mentioned, it is often in other queer media outlets. It's not in the mainstream media outlets, and it is in memoriam or things of that nature. And when they are mentioned in mainstream media outlets, they are often misgendered, as Claire said earlier, and there is often always a mention of there being a weapon when they're murdered by police officers, or there being the person being mentally ill or incompetent in some way. Next slide. So the broader implications of this, for this research, Black queer lives are seen as dispensable, leaving them unprotected by not only these Black movements that are put in place to protect Black lives or to bring to the forefront the issue of Black lives being taken by police, but also mainstream media and other communities as well. And it furthers the acts of police violence against this group. It also erases the contributions that women like the founders of BLM contribute to these movements by leaving out their identity, parts of their identity, and the intersectionality of their identity. And three, it dilutes the message of the overall goal and the overall goals of the movements, which is liberation for all Black people and not just Black men. Next slide. So the next steps for this project are to, one, complete the qualitative data analysis by hopefully spreading our reach and looking at social media to gauge really the public perception of Black folks and other groups and communities on this issue, as well as look at speeches from other Black Lives Matter leadership to see if they are even addressing the issues of other groups in their rhetoric. And with that, I want to say thank you and open it up to the next person.
Awesome, great. That was actually early. So we'd have a lot more for discussion. Okay, and lastly, unless Monique Newton is here, we have Carolyn Colt.
Good morning. Let me share my screen. Sweet. Good morning, everyone. Ayana and Claire. I'm at UC Irvine, so we're kind of neighbors. I'm in Southern California, third-year PhD student in criminology, law, and society. So at the beginning of COVID, my work is situated in police departments on the ground. I was curious about masking and how covering a third of the face now can change the perception of people for police officers and what impact that could have. So I got a pilot study grant from the Poverty Action Lab out of MIT and additional funding from the California Policy Lab to conduct a randomized control trial experiment with 2 police departments. So I'm going to talk about the study. The first portion, we did threat perception, and the second portion, we tested officers' assignment of emotion with mass cases. Okay, so like I said, the 2-part study, first part started with threat or non-threat. We took neutral faces from the Chicago Face Database across race, Asian, Black, Latinx, and white, across gender, female and male presenting folks. 32 photos were originally unmasked faces with neutral expressions, and we digitally altered them to apply the mask. For the emotional portion of the experiment, it was only Black and white races and male and female expressed genders. Over 30 photos that expressed anger, fear, happiness, but as a choice for the officers, we added surprise because literature shows that folks usually conflate fear and surprise, and also digitally applied the mask. The 2 police departments were the Los Angeles Police Department and the Denver Police Department, where we conducted these studies. This is just a snapshot of the officers that took part in the study. In LAPD, it was disseminated in spring 2021 to 582 participants, and we were able to use 437 of those entries. The majority of the divisions, LAPD has 22 divisions, the majority of them came from 4 specific ones. In Denver, the survey was disseminated in summer 2021 to 345 participants, of which we were able to use 287. They have 6 police districts, and the majority of the data came from 2 of them. Most police officers are in the age range of 21 to 61. We intentionally selected patrol and detectives with the idea that patrol officers are exposed to multiple faces over a short period of time, and detectives spend a large amount of time with maybe 1 or 2 people. But in the role of police departments, these 2 jobs are exposed to faces more on a regular basis. The gender of the officers from their disclosure, majority males and the rest female. The remaining number out of the 100 are people who didn't want to disclose. The majority of folks do not have military experience, and the control group was the group of people who saw the unmasked pictures for both the threat and emotion, and the treatment group saw the masked pictures for both threat perception and emotion assignment. So this is what the faces look like. As I mentioned before, we got the pictures from the Chicago Face database, and they're all sorted, they're all neutral faces, and they are standardized by a group of raters that rate them on their suitability for a research project. So there are hundreds of pictures, and I randomly chose equals amounts of the intersection of race and gender. And this is what they look like masked, just to show you. I'll do it again. Unmasked and masked. So it's a significant amount of facial information that's covered. So the officers either saw this set of photos or this set of photos. So what we found in this portion is that across all of the unmasked photos, Black people, male and female expressed genders, were seen as more threatening. So this is in line with what literature says. But as the masks were applied across all racial categories, the threat perception was reduced. And out of the masked faces, Asian became the most prevalent as assigned as threatening. So we were like, what does this mean? Basically, the addition of a mask for all racial groups reduces the threat perception. And some possible explanations for that is that masking at this time, think back to spring and summer of 2021, masking signaled compliance. So maybe in a law enforcement mindset, something that you're doing that shows that you already comply with the law, already comply with doing what you're told, can signal that maybe you are less threatening. And possible explanation for Asian is that the coupling of Asian and mask has a weaker signal of that compliance. For me, I've taken the time to look at what the political landscape and what news we're talking about in relation to Asian community and mask. And at that time, it's possible that some folks were digesting that information, officers were digesting that information, internalizing it. Also, officer exposure to race. So LAPD and Denver PD are geographically different, but also racially different. And an officer's exposure to race, depending on where they patrol and their norms of how they operate, may also dictate who they think may present a greater threat across racial category. So the second portion of the study was on express emotion assignments. This is a graph that shows how the photos panned out. So they were fear, anger, and happiness across male and female expressed genders. So for instance, there are 2 Black females that are exhibiting fear in the study. So it's a total of 30 photographs that we used for this. This is a sample of what they look like. Happiness, unmasked and masked, fear, unmasked and then masked, and anger, unmasked and then masked. And we asked police officers to choose what is the expressed emotion on the face of the picture. So LAPD and Denver were pretty similar in their accuracy. So these percentages are the accuracy for the police officers on which emotion. We also found that it didn't matter if they were masked or unmasked, they were still the same. So the mask didn't help or hinder if they were accurate or less accurate. So those who couldn't get fear unmasked, also their counterparts couldn't get fear masked. And those who got everything accurate masked, also their counterparts would get stuff, the expression accurate unmasked, which we thought was interesting. So as I said, masks were not a deciding factor in accuracy. This is a breakdown of the percentage of accuracy across race. So generally, all officers in both police departments were less accurate when the picture was a Black face, more accurate when the picture was a white face. Across role, what we found is that people were generally hovering around 30% accuracy across years in role, meaning that folks who are newbie police officers weren't more or less accurate than veteran police officers, starting from 1 year and we went up to 25 years of service. This reiterates the same, that the results hovered around 30% accuracy with and without the mask for this portion of the study. And that is it for me.
Great, thank you so much. So I will hand it over to our discussant.
Thank you for that. These are some wonderful papers that bring to light many issues, not only on the topic of systematic violence, but also in many cases bring to light the challenges of doing this kind of work. I particularly have comments for all the papers, but I want to think about the papers as a collective because there's many important lines that are going through each one that are very important to this dichotomy that's at play in this panel between systematic violence and resistance. And I think it's very appropriate for these times. I want to say that each of the papers bring up police as central figures in some way, or relationship to police in some way, and question at some level, I think, what can be or what should be the responsibilities of these officials in the community. And so I think that's one area that I would love to hear more about from each of you. You know, what would be the central idea for challenging systematic violence in these different studies, not only within the United States, but also thinking about in the international context with Felicity's paper in Japan. I would like to begin the discussion with the first question. I have written for each of your papers, just wanting to get a bit more sense of, I guess, some boundaries around your central idea. For Dr. Bess and Dr. Crawford's paper, I have a question broadly asking, you know, who is considered to be Black and queer in your case. And for Dr. Felicity Stones, I have who is considered to be Black in Japan. So just this question on Blackness and queerness, and I would like you to speak to how the challenges and complications for making sense for this in your different situations.
Yeah, I'll answer. Yeah. No, I do think that's an important balance that we need to pull out for sure. I think when we're specifically looking at it, we're looking at folks who we can find previous, particularly because we're looking at brutality that has already happened, that it's very clear through what we can find on the person that they did identify as a Black and queer person. And so I feel like a lot of it is self-identification is what we're looking for, and how that differs often from what the media is doing. So I think a lot of our focus has been particularly looking at the way folks self-identify. Yeah, and how maybe that didn't show up when violence happened to them, right? Yeah.
Also, when we talk about the movements that address their situations after the fact, so oftentimes if they're mentioned in queer media outlets or Black queer outlets, they mention, the organizations that they were a part of before, and that's another way to help identify.
I think you're mentioning self-identification is very important for this discussion, because we live in such complicated times. Would you like to add on, Felicity?
Please continue.
We live in such complicated times, and I think that, I'm also a doctoral student. I'm towards the latter part of my program, and I'm starting to see kind of the failure of literature where I've read, a lot about different communities, but then going to the ground and trying to do work is not as simple as apples to orange. So I'm really curious about how you navigate that in your work. You could take it, Felicity.
I was curious also in terms of how the initial perception of, let's say, the victims before you may know if they're trans or not, if that affected anything. So this is more the case of that I know, that certain Black cis women are presumed to be trans sometimes, or are asked if they're trans, and that there's sort of this weird thing going on that this happens by people who don't acknowledge that trans women are women, but also don't really want to acknowledge that cis women are women. You get this weird blend of trans misogyny and misogyny while it's trying to just insult both. And so I'm wondering with, some of the cis women, if there was any perception or any question that they were dealing with that people were dealing with trans people, if they weren't, but if that affected some of their treatment.
I think that's an important question, right? We talked a little bit, and Ayana and I are really working through this because I think there's so many dimensions to it, because we also know that you masculinize Black women, right? So there's already that part that's already happening. And so I think that's part of it. And we haven't, for the folks that we've chosen to kind of focus on, so chosen a couple of names to really specifically focus on. So for representing mass folks, we chose the case of Gabrielle Navarez, who was assumed to be having a mental moment and ended up being killed by the police, kind of just like in what it seems to be a manic moment as described by their grandmother. But and then so some of the folks we chose, we can find that they identify with communities, queer communities, and identify themselves. But I do believe that is a problem for sure that we have, but I think we have chosen specific things. But I do think that's something that we have to think about, particularly when we think about how Black womanhood is held by both the mass folks and trans women. and that disconnect that often happens where Black women are already masculinized, already considered to not be a woman and human at the same time. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of like what we're thinking right now.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Crawford. It really does get to the crux of my question about trying to suss out and contend with and navigate the literature alongside what we're seeing in our day-to-day lives. But I want to extend a question that all panelists can kind of speak to when thinking about particularly the police and that is mentioned in each of the papers that were featured today. The papers definitely press and poke holes in what's going on as far as systematic violence. I'm wondering if you could speak to the future, a bit about the future of how people are resisting or how we can begin to shift responsibilities from this space or reimagine a new kind of community effort as we've already seen this iteration of systematic violence in our communities.
I think I can speak to that some, because one of the problems with speaking about Black Japanese people is that there is no Black Japanese community to the extent that there are Black American communities. What you have are a lot of children of individual immigrants who have come, who have intermarried, and who are often, the only Black person in their circle. And if, to the extent that they may have Black friends, this will be as adults, when they've moved to major cities or when they've actively looked for community. And so one of the encouraging things that has been happening out of this movement is that you have young Black Japanese people who are trying to create community spaces and who are trying to reach out to each other and build that community. But it's difficult because we don't even know how many Black people are in the country, because Japan doesn't collect statistics based on ethnicity in their census, they only collect based on citizenship. So while you can know how many Black immigrants, well, actually, no, you can know how many immigrants there are from majority Black countries, but for example, you may only know how many Americans there are in Japan. We don't know how many white or Black, and you will know how many Japanese citizens there are, but you won't know how many of them have African or West Indian heritage. And so this is, again, one of the things that the Japan for Black Lives, they are trying to now build that database, and they're starting with a focus on how many people have experienced this police harassment and, trying to get that ethnic breakdown, but they do want to expand this wider to trying to get a sense of, okay, at the very least, how many Black people are there in Tokyo, and then see if we can go city by city and build that data themselves.
Thank you, Felicity. I'll also speak to that from my perspective. I think the problem is so complex, and there needs to be a concerted effort on multiple levels, right? So protests are useful, very useful for raising awareness, but then the work happens after that, and it's not just at the local police officer, patrol officer, individual person level. We found that diversifying the police department is great, but if you have a patrol officer unit that's majority people of color and white folks in the leadership, that really doesn't change what they do because they don't have autonomy to control where they patrol, how long they patrol. So like changing that, the leadership, allowing people to promote up, and changing police supervisors, because those are people who make the calls. We found that the police chief matters less, right? Because that's a political figurehead. So getting a person of color in that position doesn't really do much because they don't actually do the work in the way that it bleeds into the community. So I think it's that, and understanding the political giant that a police department has to operate in, right? Like in local government, it's not just a silo. There's the city manager has the pressure in the DA's office, and all of these other entities are working in concert with the police department. So how do we untie and dismantle and really just stomp out white supremacy at that level, coupled with how do we bring resources to other spaces? Can we cross-train firefighters to be EMTs? Like that's a model in some other places. Can we create or encourage the library to be a safe space where people can seek refuge and preliminary care, to be able to see that space as a place that people can go? What are the other community resources that we can use to handle citizen conflict when it doesn't need an armed response? So I think all of that needs to happen, and hopefully together, right? Hopefully with the heart and the minds of the people that it's really going to affect at the center of that. And that's complicated, right? Because in my community, speaking for the people that I speak to, this isn't on their radar. They're trying to survive. They're trying to live and trying to go to school and try to make ends meet. They're not showing up to the local community meeting about where they need resources. They just want it to be there when it's available. So I think that there's a reality to who needs to be in those spaces. How do we get people's ideas, but also get them into the vein of the people who have the power to make the change, to do the work, so it's informed and not just from this high level down, from the ivory tower down type of thing. So yeah.
Thank you so much for those responses to such a complicated question. I want to not be selfish with the attention of you and these wonderful papers. I want to open up the floor for some of the audience members to ask questions, make comments, and participate in this lively discussion.
I actually have a question for Carolyn's work. It was super interesting. Something I was wondering is, like you said, they're able to read kind of the emotions of white folks throughout. What do you think that like connection, even like that, just knowing that, what do you think that is about that ability?
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, from my perception, it's just exposure, right? Like we are constantly indoctrinated with white feelings, what that looks like, and what is a white woman's tears, what is sadness, what is fear. We see it on TV, we see it in person, we see it on dolls, it's everywhere. So I think generally we are more exposed to what that looks like versus Black faces. What does pleasure look like? What does fear look like? What does happiness look like? And then can we get a variety, right? Because it doesn't look the same on every face, but we just don't have that kind of wealth of knowledge. So what I wasn't able to get is officer race, because they weren't ready for that. But literature shows that interracially, you can see, intraracially, you know your people, right? You can read the expression of your people. So that's what I wanted to tie, but they wouldn't let me do that. If I move on with the full study, it's required. So we'll see how that negotiation happens. But honestly, I think we will see that shifting with more people paying attention to our stories. I mean, Insecure is a hit across races, right? So like, what does that mean for our humanity? What does that mean when we're exposed in a way to we can show all of these different emotions, and there's more visibility on TV where people of different shades, of different expressions are able to fully express, then it kind of gets normalized. But I think it will definitely need years of that. And it's hard when folks are trying to erase history at the same time. But Claire, to answer your question more directly, I think it's just exposure. That's what we've seen. So I think that they're just used to it.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, lots of things happening. But Carolyn, I wanted to also I think on top of like exposure, which I definitely think that you're right about that, you know, especially when you think about, you know, the work around like white habitus, for example, right, where, you know, white people live with other white people, right? And so, yeah, that's going to be, you know, you're going to see that and sort of see it as something that you've seen before. So maybe that kind of work, I think Eduardo Bonilla has some sort of work around white habitus and other folks as well. There's also work around like affective racialized emotions that you may pull from. And I think that beyond another factor might also be that, you know, maybe a much more sort of like raised based one, which exposure is, but, you know, oftentimes for a lot of individuals, especially white folks, right, it's hard to see people of color, black and brown people as full humans, right? Able to have the full range of human emotions. And I think that might be interesting to explore further. I was struck by the fear one. I guess for me, it looked like surprise and less fears. I wonder how much you got surprised there instead of fear. Yeah, so it's always interesting, right? The interpretation of emotions, right? You see somebody make a face and you're like, you know, what's that face? I don't understand it. But it's psychologically, it might be interesting to understand, like internally, why do people have a hard time sensing emotion or understanding which emotion goes with what phase? Like, I wonder if that's more of an internal thing as well, rather than, you know, if they're sort of emotionally unintelligent, for example, right? Like if they have a low EQ, right? Would that make them less likely to tell when something's fear or happiness? Or, you know, I guess happiness is pretty easy, but fear versus surprise, and things like that. But yeah, it was really interesting. So thank you.
Yeah, just to speak to that for a bit. These two police departments I have relationships with, so I know their training, and they both have emotional intelligence training. I don't know if the officers that took my survey took the training, but I know it exists. And with fear and surprise, what I initially put it on there because, one, I know that static emotion is not the reality. You have body language and voice and all kinds of things that help you say this is what that emotion is. But so often we've seen these no-knock situations, right, where you just go into a home, and that is what I was trying to speak to indirectly, of like fear versus surprise, right? Am I scared? Am I surprised? Does it matter to you? Like, how does that actually change your behavior? And if I do the full study, that's the purpose of that, linking like, okay, this is what you said threat is, or this is what you said the emotion is. Now, what do you actually do? Can I track you for a couple of months and see how your interactions play out? It will take a lot of convincing to get them on board with that, but we'll see. But thank you, yes.
Any other questions from the audience?
I have a question. All of your projects, your papers bring up media. We've talked about it in concert with resistance, in concert with understanding state violence and entities of state violence. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the utilization of media, or some hopeful ways that you've seen thus far of practices that allow media to be more useful as a tool for solidarity.
I think that strangely the pandemic has actually helped international solidarity, because even though we've always had, you know, access to video technology, it was always seen as sort of second best to have lectures and classes and discussion spaces. But because everybody was forced online at the same time, you had a lot of international events being put on, which therefore you're widening the international network, and people are now able to organize, more comfortable organizing online. And so I think that's one of the, I think, silver linings that have come out of the pandemic, even though, you know, you still at the end of the day have to do your organizational work on the ground, but at least it's expanding the amount of people whom you can share resources and tactics with. It's expanded the amount of people who, you know, can also amplify your message. It's expanded your pool of allies. And so this for me has been very interesting to also observe in the Japanese context.
I would say media is it's such an interesting great gateway into someone else's reality. Usually, folks don't have access to a wealth of difference, and usually it's by choice. Honestly, if we're honest about it, but I think specifically social media is a way to get build a relationship or build a knowledge base around difference that maybe you're limited in physically, geographically. So I think it's just encouraging folks to either watch something or listen to a podcast or follow someone on social media has a different perspective or a different lived experience, to be able to shake up our own biases and our own norms. I think is really important. How many people actually do that? I don't know. But I think that having the opportunity to do it will slowly creep in and push us towards normalizing that kind of behavior. And the younger generation is leading the way with that, with the things that they're holding us accountable to, and even in the ways that I've seen them interact differently and who they're connected to, right, across difference and across space because of our access. I think is great, but like everything, you know, in moderation, and everything can be turned on its head in a split second. So I'm curious and open to incorporating the influence of media into what I do.
Yeah, and obviously, I think media has been so important just for Black liberation in general, right? Like the move forward, and even going back to the civil rights movement, right? A lot of it was, if this wasn't televised or if cameras weren't there, would we have gotten this far? So I think that is something that we contend with. I think social media makes it interesting, and particularly what we're focusing on are like the responses to violence, right? And so a lot of that can happen in safe spaces that I do think social media provides for a lot of Black queer spaces, right? And so I think community is built, whether imagined or realistic, it's really present online and in social media spaces. And oftentimes that's why it's perplexing in a way that it doesn't translate, like we don't push that out. It's still kind of sacred, safe spaces, right? When if you think about spaces like underground ballroom scene, it's still underground ballroom scene even with pose. Right, you might have a few places that teach like Vogue, but Black trans women are protected in those spaces, and that's still kind of outside of and away from, even with the fact of knowing that they exist. So I do think it's a really interesting role, and how one, it can be protected, but two, how it can also just miss so much of what's actually happening.
Really quickly before we end, Claire and Ayana, one, something that I thought about with your work is that I have this paper with Stacy Green and Kira Samamatsu, and we're working on it now. But one of the things that we looked at is we're looking at self-identification as women of color. But one of the sort of hypotheses we had was about prototypicality. and we looked at self-identified LGBTQI women and found that those women were more likely to identify as women of color. And, sort of the theory that we have around that is, being outside of the prototypical, right? So I wonder if part of your work can also sort of educate and provide sort of like historicize, but also in terms of contemporary, right, ideas around what we think of like typical community members and how atypical individuals and communities, right, sit outside of that, and the ways in which they have to navigate not only being atypical within their community, but also all these other, right, other communities that they're not part of, right, that then they get all these stereotypes placed on top of sort of like, so kind of like questions around, belonging, right?
No,
and like in, sorry, last thing, in social psychological literature, right, one of the things is like the when you don't feel like you belong, right, you're less protected, right? And because you're not seen as sort of a typical group member, and so you're not the first to be protected, right? So I think it's like incredible work that definitely fills a gap in lots of different fields.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm currently going to write the theory section, and it's based off of like my own personal experience of my mom telling me when I came out, just like this idea of you tighten the noose around your neck, which I think says a lot to what you're talking about, right? Like this idea that like I'm making life harder for me for being Black woman, and now in her mind adding queerness to it, right? Like, and so that idea of belonging, like you're making problems for yourself, right? I do think that's so important.
Yeah. And there's like Black feminist theory around like double and triple oppression, right? And there's, Black feminist theory and like the Combahee River Collective, right? That came out of Black queer women, right? Saying we don't have a space, right? Not in women's movement, not in Black movement, and not even in the sort of cis sort of women who are interested either, right? So they sort of were really clear about that kind of space that they needed. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I wanted to add really quick as well that I think like there is something to that. Like I know so many more Black non-binary people than I know of white or any other race. And my friends and I have been talking about this, and we really feel it has to do with that. If you've already been cut out of every acceptable form of gender, that this is just a thing that is going to happen because there's nothing to be gained by your Black femininity was never recognized anyway. So what are you being gained by trying to appeal to that group?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you, Felicity. And I think that is time, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking with us, for listening to these great papers. Thank you to the presenter, Claire, Ayana, Felicity, and Carolyn, and our discussant, Onyekachi. And thank you to the audience. Thank you for being here. Yeah, really fantastic work. And hopefully I'll see some of you in other panels. Bye, everyone.